everybody to the keynote talk, and also welcome to the DEE conference. So this is the first time the conference has been entirely online. As some of you are aware, we tried to keep open the possibility of having a hybrid conference so that we would be able to meet each other face to face for those who wanted to do so. But it proved in the end that wasn't going to happen. So very sadly, we are not at Heriot-Watt in Edinburgh. I'd like to thank everybody at Heriot-Watt who worked so hard to prepare for a hybrid conference that then didn't actually happen, and also to Ashley and Martin and everybody in the Economics Network who's worked hard to put the conference together so that it could work under various contingent outcomes. So I now come to our keynote speaker, who is Frances Cairncross, who until recently was the chair of court at Heriot-Watt. Frances Cairncross has a very distinguished career as a journalist, working for publications such as The Times and The Observer, and was editor of The Economist. She has been rector of Exeter College, Oxford, and has held senior positions on the ESRC and the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Recently, she produced the Cairncross Review, A Sustainable Future for Journalism. So with her experience of journalism and academia and economics, I think we should all be very interested to hear what she's going to say, and so I shall hand over to Frances.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here, though of course I would rather be in Edinburgh and at Heriot-Watt, but this is I hope an adequate substitute. I first went into journalism in the late 1960s, and newsrooms look very much like the one that you can see here. The only thing that's missing in this picture are the clouds of cigarette smoke, and just an occasional female face should be in the far background. So it's an industry that's changed dramatically in my lifetime. Can we have the next slide, please? Ashley is kindly going to advance them for me. This is, I think, the really big moment in what has happened to journalism in my lifetime. Apple and Steve Jobs are not the only people who have changed it so dramatically. There have also been Google, which, as you know, began 22 years ago, and Facebook, which Mark Zuckerberg, as those of you who have seen the movie will know, was getting off the ground at Harvard in 2004. But I think that the iPhone, more than anything else, has been what has changed it. Next slide, please. So what we've had, as I say, has been an extraordinary example of an industry changed by technology, dramatic and continuing technological change. And I think for any industrial economist, what's been happening to the news business is an interesting subject, because it explains that new technologies don't just change the way in which goods are produced and distributed. They also affect services very dramatically, and they affect consumer tastes, they affect knowledge, and they affect the way that we use our time. What they have done to the news industry has been, I sometimes think, parallel to what's happened to department stores, because if you think of newspapers, they're very like department stores in the fact that they have worked by offering an extraordinary range of different kinds of information and entertainment. And what is now happening is that search for a single point of contact it is changing. It's moved in the case of department stores to Amazon, and it has moved in the case of news to Google, Facebook, and the products of Steve Jobs and his colleagues. New technologies have done that throughout our lifetimes, throughout history. And they change the way, in remarkably important ways, how people behave and in how nations are run. And the news, of course, is at the core of how nations run. Countries with relatively free press tend to be democracies. Countries with relatively constrained tastes tend not to be democracies, and there are good reasons for that. Let's have the next slide. Well, here is an early example of how the distribution of news, how the department stores first got disrupted. Television was really the first technology to change the level of sales and the way in which people got their news. Next slide, please. What's happened with the advent of digital technology is that we've seen three important changes. We've seen changes in how news is delivered. And that is an area where Google and Facebook have played a big part, as well as the iPhone. We've seen how advertising is changing, and we will see that Google has had a huge impact there. And we will see how people have spent their time. And all of those make a big difference to what people do, how people find their way to the news of the day. Change began with the arrival of television. It was with television that there was pressure on people's time first began. With radio, people can listen to it while they do other things. With television, on the whole, people stop doing other things and sit and watch it. So the thing about television is it affected how people spend their time. Next slide, please. So, as I say, the first change is how people receive their news, where they look for news. It's still the case that television and the television news outstrips everything else. BBC One remains the moment when everybody in the country, or at least 4/5 of adults, understand what the main things happening in the day are. Television, of course, television news gives you relatively few stories. It gives you maybe 5, 6, 7 items, maybe on a very busy day 8, but in the half hour that is the main part of the news broadcast, what 79% of adults watch, it's very hard to cram in more than a small number of stories. And if you think about what goes into a newspaper, you can see what an enormous difference there is there. In the case of the internet, it has become the second choice, radio the third choice, and Ofcom finds that print newspapers are the fourth in line as a way of discovering news. And among 16 to 24-year-olds, it's by far the most important way of discovering news. And if I was in the room with you all, I would at this stage get you to put your hand up if you still read a paper newspaper at any stage during the week. And I would guess probably that there would be about a quarter of the room, but depending on the age structure, might put a hand up, but probably no more than that. Next slide, please. So this is, I think, a really important chart, and just seeing what's been happening, because it goes back, as you can see, right into the mid-90s. And what it shows is what a decline has taken place over that period. The decline, therefore, goes back to before the days of Steve Jobs, before the days of Facebook, to the earliest time of Google. It was already underway. What you see is the pale line is households, which have been rising in Britain. The red line is national dailies, paid circulation, and the green line is Sunday paid circulation. And you can see that although Sundays have been a tiny bit more protected than dailies. All of them basically have declined, and they've declined against this background of a rising number of households. So it's a more dramatic change than just looking at the proportion of papers and how many of them are being sold would give you. Individual households are just reading fewer papers than they would have done right at the beginning. As you can see, some of them might have been taking 2 papers. What's happening now, if one's looking at the paid paper circulation, is by 2010, there had already been a striking decline. And of course, that has continued. Next slide, please. So this is what has happened to individual papers. I'm sorry, it's a little hard to read, but the most dramatic line you can see is that red line, that is the Sun, taking off under Rupert Murdoch in the 70s, becoming Britain's most widely bought paper in the 80s and 90s, and then going into a decline. The Sun wasn't, for those of us who've been conscious of newspapers in our lifetime, this has been perhaps the most extraordinary phenomenon, and the profits it made were enough to finance Rupert Murdoch's purchase of the Wall Street Journal and keep the Times going too. It's been an amazing thing, but now, as you can see, the sun is setting. It's now still widely bought, but nowhere near as widely as it would have been in its heyday. And pretty much every other paper has seen a decline. This goes down to 2015, not beyond that, I'm afraid. But the serious papers, the Times, what we used to call broadsheets, the Guardian, the FT and the Independent, have continued, their sales held up better than those of the popular press. And that's been a distinction that's taken place all the way through. Let's have the next slide. So the impact on the news groups has been to turn them into curiously double-facing companies. They're doing 2 things at once now. Almost every news group, with the exception only of the Independent, which went entirely online about 6-7 years ago, all the others are doing 2 things at the same time. They're manufacturing and they are selling digitally. And those are not just two very different technologies. Manufacturing, of course, shipping paper around the country, digital, you press a button and it goes everywhere. And they have all sorts of implications. Of course, if you're selling digital papers, if you're providing digital news, you can see quite easily what people are reading and what they're not reading, something you can't do or can't easily do with the physical product. And this is also having an impact within news groups, where if you are creating the physical product, you don't really need to involve the printers in the news conference, because they just take what you produced and turn it into sheets of paper. If you're producing digital news, you need to work much more closely with the people who make your product available to the public. And what is happening, and I know this from The Guardian and from The Economist, where I was for 20 years, what's happening is that the editorial conferences, which tend to decide what the most important story is and how you should run it, those editorial conferences increasingly are not just made up of the senior journalists, or indeed of all journalists on the paper in the group, which was the case in the past, but now includes the people who are going to put this up online. There may be a WhatsApp editor or a Twitter editor. There were people whose speciality is to know how to turn a story into the most attractive possible digital product. And these people tend to be both younger and differently educated and trained from journalists in general. And on quite a few news groups, they alter the tone of the conference. They tend to be more woke, to put it brutally, so that there is going on within these news groups not only the struggle to create these two separate products, but the internal consequences of having two different tribes bringing the product to market. The second impact has been, as it were, on the contact with the readers. Increasingly, readers reach news sites through Google, through Facebook, which means that if you just look at them on Google, the Google Snippets, as they call them, which turn up on Google News or on Facebook, the news group doesn't make any money from you looking at it. So they may make money if you go on to go to the site itself, particularly if you end up subscribing. But most news groups have found it extremely difficult. The Sun has found it impossible, for example, to persuade readers to pay enough to make it worth doing, or to make it worth trying to make people pay. And part of the problem is that the main news website is free. Let's have the next slide, please. That allows you to see what the main news website is. So the percentage of stories, of all the stories that people say they read on the BBC is that accounts for 40%. The Guardian, which is also free, for 14%. The Mail, which again is also free, for 10%. MSN again, 9%. So if you look for those publications where you pay to subscribe, they are vanishingly small up at the top. And the result is, when you see this argument going on at the moment about what's happened to the license fee, a lot of that is driven by a feeling in politics that the BBC gets all this free money and uses it to beat the struggling news groups which are trying to charge for their product. Next slide, please. So apart from the shift from physical to online that's going on, the second big change has been the change in advertising. All through the past 2 centuries, advertising and newspapers have worked side by side. And one of the little realized reasons why news groups were so slow to react to the arrival of the internet was, by trying to charge for their product, was that the 1990s saw an extraordinary boom in advertising in newspapers. And when the internet came along, a lot of these papers were persuaded that they could get, it would allow them simply to spread the ads that they would continue to get more widely through, it would raise their revenue from advertising, because they would be readable all around the world and everywhere for free. And that would basically be the business model that they would follow. And it took about a decade for the penny really to start to drop, and for news groups to understand that actually the downward drift in physical circulation that I showed you before, and then the more rapid drift that took place through after about 27, that it hid the fact that they had this experience of booming newspaper ads. And leading that view was Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, who very much took the view that information wanted to be free. The Guardian would make its copy available free, and that it would pay for that by a boom in advertising, and in the case of The Guardian, by having the Scott Trust a large wad of money to subsidise it. But that view has now changed. Let's have the next slide, please. So here you can see this advertising boom, which really, this is actually on, as you can see, produced by the Pew Center, and it shows the revenue of American newspapers in US dollars. And it also shows circulation, excuse me, in the yellow line. And it shows circulation plateauing, and this extraordinary rise in the 90s for really going on for 15 years or so in advertising. And that has now, as I say, as you can see, the advertising has now shrunk in ways that I'll come on to in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is again just showing you what has now happened with digital advertising. The amount of digital advertising revenue that newspapers get online when they're with their product online is tiny, is a very small part of the total output of a newspaper. And social media, the pink line, is what has dominated. That goes from 2009 to about 5 years ago, but the trend has continued. Next slide, please. So the reason for this is partly that just online is a superior technology for advertising. You can search more accurately. If you want to find a restaurant in a town you've never visited, if you go on to Google, you'll find it very quickly. If you go on to Facebook, people will tell you if it's any good. And the internet just produces data that is clearly not available to conventional original newspapers. What Google knows about you is extraordinary. I don't know how many of you have looked at the information on your mobile phone, which tells you exactly where you've been and when and where. And if you've got an Android phone, it's worth having a look at that. Facebook still also knows where you've been, but produces it in a sorry, not Facebook. iPhones also know where you've been, but produce it rather more, rather less detailed than an Android phone does. And of course, they know where you shop. And Amazon, which is an increasingly important player in this, knows exactly what it is that you want to buy. So advertising has become a different kind of business from what it was 15 or 20 years ago. If you pay Amazon, they will make sure that when somebody searches for a product that you have, it's at the top of the list of what they will find when they go onto the Amazon site. And that is very different from giving people a picture and hoping that they might want to buy it at some point. And if they do, that they will think of you. Let's have the next slide, please. The most dramatic effect of this has been on classified advertising. If you were looking for a car, you will go to Auto Trader. If you're looking for a job, if you're looking for a restaurant, whatever kind of thing that you might have looked for, if you're looking for a house, you won't go first of all to classified ads. Classifieds were advertisements that were very specific, and the three main categories were vehicles, housing, accommodation, and jobs. And for local papers and regional papers, they were extremely important because they were not just a huge source of revenue. They were also, on top of that, a reason for actually buying the paper. So on the day when the jobs were advertised, people would go out and buy the paper just for that. They would go out and buy the paper just to see what their neighbour was putting the house on the market for. Classifieds were a form of content as well as a form of revenue, but they are also perfect for Google, particularly for Google, and if you want to buy, and also for various category killers like purple bricks. I'm sure if you're buying a house, the last thing you've done has been to look in your local paper and see what houses are available. You've gone online. Next slide, please. So what you can see happening is a double hit. The existing slow drift away from print that accompanied the rise of television accelerated dramatically, and the nature of advertising has also radically changed. It's been dramatic for local papers, really devastating. That the reason that the inquiry that I ran 2 years ago was set up in the first place was pressure from local members of parliament, alarmed that they no longer might have a paper in which to report their local speeches. And for the Nationals, the biggest problem has been papers like The Sun and the Express, which have found it. The Sun briefly tried to charge its readers and abandoned it because its readership plummeted. And other red tops, as people used to call them, have learned the same lesson. They have now a very shrunken news coverage. They still sell some copies, but fewer and fewer, and to an older market. Next slide, please. And the news groups were, as I say, slow to respond to what was happening. They particularly found it difficult to ask for online subscriptions. There are a few publications that have cracked it. The Financial Times, very early on, started to ask for subscriptions to its online operation. The Economist did as well. The Economist charges the same for an online subscription as for a paper subscription, which is a very interesting and telling strategy. And the Spectator has done well, and some of the magazines have done well online. But it's been a very slow business. The FT, which I think started charging round about 2004, has only now reached a situation where it's making a profit out of online subscriptions. And so it's been a very difficult hill to climb. And there are still lots of papers that are offering online news for free. Next slide, please. So there's been the change in where people get their news. There's been the change in advertising. And the third big change that's come about since the day of Steve Jobs' claim that it changes everything has been the competition for people's time. This is what you used to do when I first went to work. Let's see what happens now. I think you'll all recognize that. And of course, it's not necessarily news that people are reading online. It may also be all sorts of other things, playing games or watching television. Next slide, please. So it's taken me rather a long time to get to the question, does it matter? But I think it's a difficult question. It's quite clear what consumers want. They want online news, It's cheaper and faster to provide. Paper is expensive, in some ways more environmentally friendly, and you can read it all over the world. You can read the New York Times, you can get a certain amount at a very low cost. You can read papers right across America, in Australia, in the English language, in India, all over the world. And you can have most of that free as long as you've got internet access. So the question is, do people want it because it's free? Or do they want it, would they pay for it? Advertising is not going to pay for it. Are people going to be willing to pay subscriptions? And the answer to that is still, it's not clear. Let's have the next slide. Jeff Bezos, who, as you know, now owns the Washington Post, talks about the gift of the internet. I think some of his journalists may find that puzzling, but there are now a huge number of new ways to find news. And I think if I were in the room with you, I would be getting you to put up your hands and say how many of you get your main news from Twitter or from Unheard or from one of the Substack blogs or from nextdoor.com. You know, what do you turn to first? Do you turn to a conventional news product, or do you turn to this extraordinary flowering Politico? You know, we've just seen being bought by the Germans for a really very impressive price. But so these are valued. But what is the future? What is it that people want more? Let's have the next slide. And how do you get people to pay? Well, this is the question that a lot of countries are asking. There are the platforms, and increasingly governments in Europe, Australia, are trying to find ways to extract money from Google, from Facebook, to cover the cost of news. And so far, most of that money has come in form of various kinds of charitable donations, effectively, by the large companies. What about consumers? Can people eventually be persuaded to take out subscriptions? And will enough people subscribe enough money to keep together a reasonable supply of high quality informative news? Or should government subsidize it? I mean, since news groups exist, at least in part, to test and criticize government, that's a particularly difficult solution to come up with. But many countries are asking this question. Let's have the next slide. Should the platforms be made to pay, and if so, how? Here you see what a large chunk of readers actually come to what national newspapers produce. There's the source traffic on the right. You can see that 43% of national newspapers' traffic comes via Google, 22% via Facebook, 35% via other, and other back in 2013 was 59%. So, you know, the increasingly Google in particular governs, is the gateway to the national press. Next slide, please. The fact that Google in particular shows readers these snippets, these short news teasers, as it were, on Google News, is a source of particular disagreement both in Australia, in America, and in the UK. The news groups have always syndicated their copy, but usually people have paid for syndicating it. Now they say these snippets are a form of syndication and should be paid for. But what has happened in the past is that when the snippets have, when governments have tried to charge, or news groups have tried to charge, the snippets stop. And if the snippets stop, then news groups lose readers and they lose what advertising revenue they get. So it's turned out to be very difficult to deal with the problem that way by charging for the scraps of news that appear on Google and in Facebook. In Britain, there's a new digital markets unit, which is clearly wondering whether and how it should intervene in this debate. And it has not yet really developed a policy, but I think it would be worth watching over the months ahead. Next slide, please. So, will consumers start to pay more? I think they are starting to pay more. They're already paying for various, the extent to which consumers pay for services provided online is increasing, and is starting. It's interesting watching The Guardian presenting itself as a sort of club, and trying quite hard to persuade people to pay a basic, or to pay for rather more, to pay a premium, to be a premium subscriber. And you can see that news groups are trying much harder now, the upmarket ones, to extract payments. But that raises the question: what happens for the Sun? And the sidebar of shame is that, as they call it in Fleet Street, is what the Mail produces. Those columns of titivating tales, mainly about the misdeeds of Meghan and Harry and of various film stars. Would you pay for that? The Mail is very nervous about trying to test the water, and on the whole finds that people wouldn't pay, or at least wouldn't pay yet. Next slide, please. So this is the most difficult question of all. Should the government intervene? Governments should clearly intervene where there are problems on competition grounds, though exactly how they intervene, how they attack the power of the platforms is very difficult. And it seems to me that very little is likely to happen unless the United States starts taking the antitrust implications of the growth of the platforms really seriously. Clearly, government should intervene in the sense of promoting media literacy, but that's something that you learn at school, and it's basically critical thinking. And if you can't teach people at school how to read, how to decide whether a news story is fake or true, then education isn't doing its job properly. And yes, perhaps to try to save an independent local press, and that was the area where my review basically wanted to see an attempt to do some subsidizing of local journalism, particularly because it is the main way in which local communities understand what their various instruments of government, the local council, the courts, what is happening, what is being done to them and for them. And I think it's really important that local press survive, although in the UK, quite a lot of local press belongs to large groups that are owned by American hedge funds, and it's rather hard to make a case for subsidizing them. So it shouldn't, as I say, be used to save the Sun or reach one of the biggest groups, which has revenues over £600 million and shouldn't need government subsidy. So intervention is difficult, but we need not to discard it as a tool. Next slide, please. So what else might government do? Government's not saving department stores. But some news, and this was the argument in the review that I did, some news is a public good. Some news is about the way in which societies use usually public money to guarantee the supply of public goods. So news about how the local council is operating is something which people ought to have. We called it public interest news, not just that, but all the area of what local papers did. And ultimately what we came up with was the idea of an arts council, a body that was operated entirely at arm's length from government, or as far as possible at arm's length from government, but which had the possibility of helping create and sustain an independent local press. And I think that's still something that I would love government to take very seriously. Next slide, please. So this is an area that's still evolving. We're seeing an extraordinary and very important technological revolution take place, and it takes time to know, and will take years to know exactly what its effects will be. This is a quote here from Alfred Marshall, writing in the late 19th century, a time when there was a great deal of technological change taking place, and pointing out that it's not immediately that you work out what a new discovery is going to do. It takes time to see where it's going to go. So the physical newspaper, I suspect, probably will not be around very much in 20 years from now. But news and professional journalism, I think, will survive. Quite how it will survive is something we are still going to be unsure of for several years to come. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Frances, thank you ever so much for a very interesting and provoking talk about such an important topic. We now have an opportunity for questions or comments. So I've asked people if they think they'd like to, they can put questions in the chat, or alternatively you can raise your hand, and I shall try to ensure that I can see you, or else if you feel you're
being... Will you compare this, Edmund? Will you compare this, please?
I shall compare this, yes. So I shall try to take the questions and feed them to you, Frances. So I'll obviously some of you may still be formulating questions. I noticed that Fabio has put a question in the chat. Fabio, I don't know whether you want to unmute and ask it direct to Frances.
Hello, Frances. Thank you so much. I tried to formulate it in the easiest way possible, and I failed miserably, I think, because obviously so much was already covered in your talk, and that sparked even more reasoning about other issues. So what I was trying to come at is the fact that also, like, there is an issue with the kind of quality, and how can we substitute different sources and different types of news? Because due to demographics, due to level of education, obviously some readers like Facebook news, and some other like to read the BBC, and the process becomes endogenous as well, in my opinion. Like, the news themselves are just sort of shaping up in a different way, and coming to the point of claiming different truths, which is what we are experiencing today. So price discrimination doesn't work. We cannot charge to discriminate quality. Signaling doesn't seem to work because somebody like lemons, somebody like really bad cars. So we cannot use that either. And my fear is that we are converging. We are actually what we are seeing in an Otelli model, where we are actually seeing a convergence of less reputable news and what they used to be the new school, converging towards the center. So I think it really matched perfectly what you were discussing at the very end of your presentation, talking about the survival of professional journalism. And are we sure that is this going to survive? And is this what people want, what the average reader want? And I'm not leading you to an answer. You know, I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Just tell me, Fabio, what do you read yourself first thing in the morning?
The BBC on my mobile app. That's literally still in bed. I'll just have a look at what is going on.
Yeah. Well, that is, of course, the most subsidised news producer in the UK. In fact, it's entirely subsidised. I think that we're very much seeing an industry in evolution. It's clear that this has not yet reached a settled stage, and the swing from producing a physical product to producing an online product is something that still hasn't worked its way through, and for some news groups it may not work its way through. When you look at that extraordinary pattern of the circulation of the sun, you can see that reading fairly questionable news, opinionated and questionable news, is nothing very new. You don't need the internet for this to happen. People were perfectly capable of going out and buying it. The really big question is, I think, we've removed an important barrier to entry into journalism. If you look at something like Substack, or indeed if you look at Twitter, individuals can be journalists, as it were, and there are people who follow one particular Twitter user or who put out their blog on Substack, which is read by 10 people. And these are today's journalists, and in a sense, they're as much journalists as the people in the 17th century who produced news sheets and handed them out in coffee shops. So I think that we will still see people who want to spend money to get really good news, and that will be particularly true of financial news. What I'm more worried about is local news, because those are small markets anyway, and they were particularly dependent on classified advertising. I'm worried about that. And I'm worried to some degree about how people, about the fake news issue, although I think that probably we assume that that's created by the rogue news groups more than is perhaps really the case. Who's next?
Thank you. I think Arnab Bhattacharjee has a question on public good aspect of news.
Yeah.
Arnab, do you want to unmute and?
Yes, thank you. Fascinating presentation, Frances. Sorry, my camera is not working. I cannot put it on. I'm very sorry about that. So my question is, what kind of news is a public good? And then follow on is there a space for national news agencies to circulate, for example, nationalist news in public interest? They're paid from the taxpayers' money. So if the taxpayer want that, maybe that is in national interest.
Well, you see, in a way, in Britain, we have that in the BBC. We have a national news provider paid for by this extraordinary system which made it very hard to sustain. But it is effectively a national news provider. A subsidized national news provider. Now, as far as what news is a public good, I think you can define really two kinds of news as public goods. One is, I think, investigative journalism. It's extremely important. It's extremely expensive, or it's often expensive, and it's difficult. When I was doing the review, we talked to an organization in the United States which specialized in doing investigative journalism, which talked about, one of the staff said, we drill a lot of dry wells. You think there's dirt there, but there really isn't. But the other I think is really particularly local journalism. And I think it's, as I said, that because the local market for journalism is so small, I think we really may need to find ways to sustain it. And we're still working out how we do it. And at the moment, at least part of the way in which local journalism is sustained is by something called statutory notices, which are the notices that local authorities and government have to place in local papers, saying that they're going to be digging up the road, or that such and such a road is going to be closed, or whatever. And these statutory notices provide now really rather a large share of the subsidy to local press. It's a crazy way of doing it, but it's the only way of doing it that has worked up to now.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, there's another question from Marco Gunderman about financing on the license fee.
Yeah.
So Marco, I don't know whether you want to expand on that.
Yeah, it's just that I share the view that some news is a public good, but I wonder whether that justifies the license fee when Channel 4 can do it without a subsidy. And, Channel 4 is doing a lot of the things that the BBC is doing, but it doesn't cost us anything.
Well, it's publicly owned, at least at the moment, effectively. I mean, it's a very odd animal, Channel 4. It won't be publicly owned for much longer. And we'll see what happens to it when it's set free. I suspect that it's, if it's not, the question will be over whether it has to retain its obligation to provide news, which the terrestrial channels have. I mean, what happens with television is a whole can of worms, because, as you know, digital broadcasters, Netflix, for example, has no obligation to provide news, whereas the terrestrial broadcasters have to provide news. It's part of their operating license. As viewers move across to Disney and Netflix and so on, they will be less and less likely to be exposed to television news. And as that is currently the most widely, the place where most people gain their news, the public good argument becomes even greater. Is it important for the country to have some way of getting relatively impartial news across to the great majority of the population? Is that really something that matters to us? Does it make a democracy work better if we have that, or does it not matter? I happen to think it matters a good deal, but I can think of lots of people who might disagree with that.
Frances, I'm slightly going to abuse my position as chair here and just ask you something that you haven't mentioned. One broadsheet newspaper had journalists leave it because they claimed that advertising revenue from a military dictatorship was affecting the stories it was covering, and there are several newspapers in Britain today which are owned or partially owned by nationals of foreign powers that might reasonably be regarded as enemies. You haven't sort of said much about that. Perhaps financing will just come from foreign dictators.
Well, you know the joke about how do you become a newspaper millionaire? You start off as a billionaire and then you buy a national newspaper. In no time at all, you're a newspaper millionaire. I mean, the Independent is, I suppose, the most egregious example in that it's belongs to the son of a KGB member. My husband writes for it. I don't think he has ever been told not to write something because it might offend the Saudis or the Russians. He isn't writing on an area where he would be likely to try and take them on. I mean, I think if you look at other papers, on the whole, the ownership of newspapers has been in the hands of relatively few people who aren't necessarily ones that you would choose if you were a benign owner. Lord Harmsworth owned at one stage the Mail, which he had set up. He owned Times, he owned Observer, he owned something else. I mean, he was not a foreign dictator, but the ownership works as long as the thing sells. And the test of the market is there every day. And I think that any newspaper that skewed its coverage for any length of time to please a foreign dictator would find that it vanished from sight pretty quickly.
Okay. We have a question on another sort of political effect on news content from Isleda Zissimos. Slade, did you want to summarize that? Or?
Hi, yes. Hi, thank you. Thanks for the interesting talk. So here I'm switching from the sources of finance for the news to actually the news content itself. And my question is, there is this emergence of a canceling culture.
An emergence, sorry, I didn't understand. An emergence.
Canceling culture.
Canceling culture. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that has seems to be affecting even scientific research. Mm-hmm. So my question is, how do you see canceling culture affecting journalism and the ability of journalists to say the truth?
Well, the truth is a slippery concept, I'm afraid. My truth may not be your truth. Very often truth has a large dollop of opinion mixed into it. I mean, if you are thinking of, for example, Suzanne Moore, who for many years was a very successful columnist on The Guardian, wrote a piece suggesting that that women had wombs, which was considered an outrageous suggestion, a way of defining women by quite a lot of her colleagues on the paper, to an extent that she resigned eventually. So that there are papers that have particular views, where the staff have particular views, which may be at odds with at least some of their readers. The good news is that in the UK, we're lucky enough to have an unusually large number of national papers. I call them papers for shorthand because, of course, they're both papers and online. And therefore, there are ones that may be vulnerable to a cancelling culture, and there are other ones which succeed by mocking the cancelling culture. You only have to read the Mail online to see the cancelling culture held up daily to ridicule. So I think that as long as there is a choice of truths available, and as long as those who are presenting different truths argue their case fairly and accurately, I'm reasonably happy with that. I think we need a variety of opinions. We don't need a single view on the whole in most areas of public life. I think it's reasonable for some newspapers to say that the retreat from Afghanistan was a sensible move, and others to say it's a disaster. That's not a problem for me. I want to hear both sides of the argument. I want to see different people spin the story in different ways.
Okay, I think we have time for just two more questions which are floating about. Michael McCann, you have a question on broadcast news.
Oh yeah, Francis. Yeah, thank you very much, Edmund. Yeah, very interesting presentation. My question's a bit provocative. I suppose we always talk about the distinction between what is broadcast news and print news or internet news. And I was just wondering, in the modern age, aren't they all just the exact same, really? They're all just news media companies. And so should they be treated the same in terms of rules around impartiality? Should newspapers and news websites be subject to some rules around the same rules as impartiality that broadcast news have?
Well, as you say, they're not actually all treated the same, because broadcasters are governed by Ofcom, which has just astonishingly said, Piers Morgan, who is allowed to say the sort of outrageous things he said. I think good for Ofcom, but that's just my mischievous attitude. But on the whole, broadcasters have very strict rules about what they can say and how they can say it. These do not, as far as newspapers go, they are covered only really effectively by the laws of libel and the ability of people to protest to a rather weak regulatory body if they're upset by what they say. And I think that juxtaposition works reasonably well in the UK. That means we get a very much wider variety of opinions than I think people get in many other countries. And that seems to me to be a good thing. It's obviously important that, that a news group that produces lies is that people could say these are lies. But on the whole, usually they're not lies, usually they're opinions, and spun in different ways. And a divergence of opinions, in my opinion, is a good thing.
Yeah, I think Ofcom's exoneration of Piers Morgan was less unqualified than claimed by the Daily Mail, from my reading of it.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
We've just got one last question or comment from Dean Garrett. So Dean, could you put that?
Thanks, Edmund. Thanks, Francis. That was really, really interesting. I'm going to be very supportive of your comments, and maybe you want to expand a little bit further on the protection of local, regional media, news outlets. Perhaps if I start by saying I'm in the centre of what probably became the centre of the pandemic in England. I'm in Leicester, and I saw how important during the pandemic local radio, local journalism was in, I suppose, enabling, fostering those bonds, those things that keep communities together. I suppose we call it social capital. So I guess I'm not asking a question. I'm just being very, very supportive of what you're saying. And I was also thinking that it would be very sad at a time when we're talking about levelling up, the importance of communities, opportunities, and for those communities to be heard, if at the same time the voices through media at a local and regional level were silenced. So I'm just very supportive of what you're saying there, Francis.
Great. Well, let me just end, since I think we're winding up now, with two things. First of all, a plea to all of you to pay money for your news that you read, and particularly to buy your local paper or to support your local paper in whatever way you can. I think that's the one thing an individual can do that matters, and encourage others to do the same. Encourage your students to pay for news. And the second thing is, you're all economists. This is an area that is extremely, of innovation, that's extremely interesting, as you can see. And I think there's probably lots of good research projects here. And we need high quality research in this area. There isn't enough of it. There are people like the Reuters Institute in Oxford that are doing work, people like the Pew Institute in the United States. There are organizations doing it, but it would be great to have more economists just thinking about the future of news and how it can and why it should be supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances, for a brilliant talk and for being so generous in your time and answering questions. Now, can I come back to Frances's talk, and can we please show our appreciation by the appropriate electronic clap, and to how much we appreciate it. And thank you very much, Frances, for really stimulating and interesting talk.
Thanks. I enjoyed it. Really pleased. Thank you, folks.